saving nature, putting nature first, which is what most of us are really committed to. And there's going to be a chance for some questions. We should wind up around about 7, and then Kevin's around for a little bit longer after that if you had some particular questions you wanted to talk to him about. So over to Kevin. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. It's fantastic to be here and great to see this amazing crowd. Some of you might have heard me talking about the Forest and Bird History Project, but the person who I'll introduce you to in a moment, Captain Valentine Sanderson, who was the founder of Forest and Bird, in the 1920s did a national speaking tour, and we have in our archives, word that I use with the inverted commas because really it's boxes full of stuff. But we have found newspaper accounts of what he said on the speaking tour. And when he spoke in Dunedin, Forest and Bird had to, the next day, alongside the account of what he said, publish an apology because some of the people who had bought tickets to go and hear him speak had not been able to get into the town hall because the doors had been stormed by a crowd of people who were so desperate to hear what Captain Sanderson had to say that they couldn't get in. So that's the new standard for my speaking tour this year.
We've been paid to come.
I should say a couple of other things about that speaking tour. One, he used a set of lantern slides, which we have, and so we'll be reinstating those for my speaking tour. He also toured with an orchestra that played music that had been specially composed for Forest and Bird. So again, if there are any offers from people in the audience tonight, you'd be very welcome to play some music. So I've got some slides. What I say might loosely parallel what's on the slides. For some of you, it'll be hard to see these because of the oblique angle. But anyone know where this is?
Lake Hague. Colbert?
No. It's Lake Angeles in Nelson Lakes National Park. It's one of my favourite places. I've been at Forest and Bird now for getting on for 4 years, and I wish I could actually get up there again. Actually, to get there you have to climb Mount Robert, which unfortunately, due to seismic activity, which you'll understand in this town, seems to get steeper.
It's not your age.
That's funny. No.
Just press forward.
So
The arrow that's to the right.
yeah,
Kick it.
If it's a PDF, then you need to go down.
You invited me. Anyone here under 12 can help them?
so while my lovely assistant actually deals with this technical issue, so the next slide gives you a picture of Captain Sanderson, imagine. And it mentions that Forest and Bird is nearly 100 years old, which is why we're doing a history project. So we turn 100 in 2023. We are one of the oldest community-based organisations in the country, also one of the largest community-based organisations in the country, and we have nearly 50 branches around the country. So every part of Aotearoa is covered by a Forest and Bird branch. And in the background of this slide, just imagine this.
That might have been old, didn't it? I just think it needs to be restarted.
Reboot.
So in the background of the slide, you'll see a scene of a place that looks a bit like a Hawke's Bay sheep station. So a lot of grass, some hills, not a lot of native vegetation. You know how in Hawke's Bay, or actually come to think of it, on some parts of the Canterbury Plains, you could stand turn around through 360 degrees and not see a single thing that is native to this place. Well,
Microsoft person.
so in the background of this slide, you can see that as well. Except that place, we'll get to see it in a moment, but just imagine it for the time being.
That's 5G.
Yeah, that'll be it. It's causing it. It's either that or the chemtrails. Yeah. So this particular place is Kapiti Island, and Kapiti Island was Forest and Bird's first project. So Captain Sanderson came to Kapiti Island, saw a place that had very little in the way of native vegetation left, and said, we can do something about this, and set about restoring Kapiti. And for those of you who've had the good fortune to be able to visit Kapiti in more recent years, you will see it bears no resemblance at all to this scene that I'm showing you, a barren wasteland. So the next slide shows a series of dots around the country where Forest and Bird branches are located.
How many dots?
And there are 47 dots.
Name them.
I can if I
Go
need
on
to.
then. Go on then, because I can't
So
see it on there.
and so you'll see that the branch located here in Christchurch is our North Canterbury branch, for example, and there's a few people here from the North Canterbury branch. So if you're not involved in Forest and Bird now, and you'd love to be, see me afterwards and I'll connect you with the branch. And then the following slides show Forest and Bird is doing some of the things that they do week in and week out. So we are a voice for nature, but we also give nature a hand. So Forest and Bird branches around the country are involved in trapping and planting and removing weeds and doing all sorts of practical conservation work, as well as education and research and looking after reserves and advocacy. So doing submissions on regional and local plans. Actually, come to think of it, you've got a couple of those due in the next few weeks.
Yeah.
So I think the district plan is, I think submission's closing on the 24th of March, I would say. Yeah. The annual plan, yep. And then the ECAM plan the following week.
No, same day.
So one's the 26th of March and one's the first week of April. I can't remember which way around they are. But they're both important.
Yep.
They both need you to actually put some energy into them. Forest and Bird is. We can give you a hand with submissions if you'd like to do that. So you can see pictures of kids out there sort of doing some trapping. There's a child holding a stoat and other people getting ready to go and do their work in the bush. Why are we doing this? I thought one of the things that I would talk about tonight, and probably I won't do on the subsequent appearances on this tour, is talk about my dear friend and colleague Jeanette Fitzsimons, who passed away on Thursday night. I had the honour really of working with Jeanette for several years in Parliament, and she was an extraordinary person. And one of the things I was looking for, so I could show you tonight, was a slideshow that she and I put together for a project that we led in Parliament called the Green New Deal, which was, in 2009, a different way of approaching the global financial crisis and the way that that impacted on our country. So the government of the day was going to be spending about $1 billion in economic stimulus. And what we were saying is, actually there's a better way of spending that kind of money, a way that not only would stimulate the economy and do all of the economic things that the government was wanting to do, but also would be good for community and good for the planet. And one of the things that Jeanette taught me about, even though I had a bit of a background, so my background's in geophysics, and algebra, and epidemiology, and health economics. And one of the things that Jeanette taught me about economics was ecological economics. And so in this PowerPoint that actually I don't have for you tonight, but you could imagine are on the screen, right? Is a diagram from Herman Daly, who's one of the great ecological economists. And if you've ever heard David Parker speak, you'll have heard this quote because he uses it in literally every speech he ever gives on any topic. He says, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the other way around. Now, he learned that from Jeanette. And we use that in that PowerPoint because what that says is that everything that happens inside the economy has to happen within the boundaries of the environment. Everything that happens within society has to happen within the boundaries of the environment. And what that means is we as human beings, as a society, we need nature. And one of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight is that nature needs us. So nature needs us because it is quite literally at breaking point. At the last election we talked about nature being in crisis. What we now know is that crisis is at the extreme end. That if we don't act now, if we don't put nature first, that actually we will start losing those things. So the Environment Aotearoa report that the Ministry for the Environment put out last year, which summarised a series of other reports it had made this point extremely starkly. It said that 2/3 of our native ecosystems are in collapse. And you'll have heard either me or someone else talk about this number of 4,000. There are now more than 4,000 native species in our country that are threatened with or at risk of extinction. Now that's an extraordinary number. Just take a moment to think what 4,000 is, what it looks like. We are, in our country, one of the world's treasure troves of biodiversity. We are the country, actually there's a bit of a dispute with Madagascar, but we are the country in the world with the highest proportion of endemic species, so species found really only here. But we are also the country in the world with the highest proportion of our endemic species at risk of extinction.
What about the Galapagos?
Well, that's just one particular part. So there's certainly a lot of endemic species, but part of Ecuador, and So of those 4,000, Forest and Bird's part of an international organisation called BirdLife International, and so I get along to BirdLife meetings with my equivalents from organisations from every other country in the world, essentially. And they talk about the dire situation in their country with maybe, say, 15% of their bird species at risk of extinction. Well, in our country, it's 80%.
Yeah.
80% of our bird species are at risk of extinction. 90% of our seabirds. And we have a very special role for seabirds in the world because around 1/3 of the world's seabird species actually spend time in our waters. So the job that we do of looking after them matters to the whole world. So 90% of our seabirds, all of our frogs, for example, and you could go through all of the different taxa. Ruth could probably say something about it.
There it is.
Yeah, and anyway, as I was saying, I was just...
Thanks, Johnny.
You tell me where to get to.
Yeah, okay. There's the dots. Yeah.
Dots.
That's our mission, protect and restore nature in Aotearoa. These are some of the things we've done. We've been fantastic. These are some of the things our branches do. Here are some of the people from one of our branches doing some of those things.
Stoke.
Kid with a stoke, and this is where we are. So,
Thanks, Johnny.
thanks, Johnny. Yeah. So what I'm going to do now is run through some of the domains that Forest and Bird's working in. So, here's the marine domain. New Zealand government has promised that 10% of our waters will be protected from fishing effort. It's currently less than 0.5%, actually less than 0.4%. That is one of the worst rates in the world. One of the reasons for the loss of those seabirds, or the high risk and threat to seabirds, is the huge number that are killed as bycatch in the fishing industry.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, but really.
yeah, no, thanks, Genevieve. So over 15,000 seabirds a year. And it's not just birds. So the New Zealand sea lion is the world's rarest, most endangered sea lion in the world. What makes it endangered? Well, largely it's that we catch sea lions as part of our squid fishery in the Southern Antarctic Islands. And I could make the same point about dolphins. So I'll come on to that in a second.
I hope ECAN's listening to this. Thank you.
So these are some of the things that Forest and Bird does in the marine area. So the best fish guide, which you'll have seen. We have had this year as the Zero Bycatch Pledge, where we've been asking the community to sign a pledge to support a goal of catching no bycatch in the fishing industry. Now, that's not to say we'll actually achieve that goal. It's just saying we're going to try to not catch things. I have to say it's been enormously successful in the public. We are now starting to hear ministers and the industry reflecting back that idea that they should be setting out to catch nothing. So the next step is, well, let's actually have some rules that actually require those mitigation measures that you'll have seen in TV ads. So the fishing industry, right, has been running ads on TV. And from those ads, you'd have got the impression that they were doing lots of things to try and stop other things being caught. You might have taken a moment to think, what are they trying to sell me with this ad?
Bovine fecal material.
Yeah.
Tox though, please.
The fact is, they're not trying to sell you anything. They're trying to buy something.
Oh my God.
They're trying to buy your social license for the way that they go fishing. And their campaign is failing. The kind of mitigation methods that they show on those ads, yes, are used by some in that industry. What we need to do, though, is to make those methods mandatory throughout that industry. Currently, we're a long way from that. We have been campaigning for the Kermadec Ocean Sanctuary and the southeast marine protected areas. I have to say, we haven't achieved any progress on those in the current term of government. Marine protected areas more generally, so actually moving beyond that 0.4% to at least the 10% that we've promised, and preferably onto something like 30%, which is what a lot of our Pacific neighbours have already achieved. That's the kind of thing that we need to be doing. We've been working with other organisations on a seabed mining campaign. So we won a court case that's being appealed to the Supreme Court against Trans-Tasman Resources, who wanted to do seabed mining off the Taranaki coast for iron sand. The thing is, if they win that case, if they get to do that mining, not only do we destroy the habitat for everything that lives there, including, by the way, our own population of blue whales. But they also set a precedent for all of the other companies that are lining up behind them to do seabed mining somewhere else around our shores, such as on the Chatham Rise.
Sorry, what's seabed mining?
Well, so you think about mining as people dig a hole in the ground and get something out. This is a mining operation that happens on the bed of the sea, underwater. So they're digging into the seabed to get the minerals that they want.
Dredging, aren't they?
Yeah, dredging it, pretty much.
Often dredging. It's not only that.
But yeah, explosives
Yeah.
too, sometimes.
Another forest and bird action this year has been working with the Motiti Rohe Moana Trust.
Another one.
Yep. So this is an iwi-based trust in the Bay of Plenty area. And the case that we have won in partnership with them has given us a new tool to use to protect marine ecosystems. Until now, we've essentially been dependent on the Fisheries Act and the actions of the Minister of Fisheries using provisions of that act to protect marine ecosystems. What this case that we've won allows us to do is to work with regional councils, because this case establishes that regional councils not only can but must protect marine ecosystems in the coastal zone.
Are you
So-
listening again? Sorry.
So it's a fantastic new tool that we can and are already starting to use. So looking on land, I sort of ran through some of these numbers before. 80% of our birds, 88% of lizards. It's actually 74% of our freshwater fish. All of our frogs threatened with extinction. Only 5% of unmanaged kiwi chicks survive to adulthood. Our national bird, and that's one of the few species of the 4,000 that actually have active recovery plans in place. Think about the invertebrates, for example. They don't have those recovery plans, and just slide in obscurity into extinction. And yet, only a minority of even our conservation land, public conservation land, has comprehensive pest control. Well, how can that be? Well, it comes about because less than half of 1% of the government's budget gets spent on conservation. Less than half of 1%. So this thing that most New Zealanders, everyone in this room, and most people, if we asked them on the street, would say is really important, actually has really only token amounts of money spent on it. So we've done something about that. We've worked with the government. So this government in 2018 made the largest ever increase to DOC funding. That was really good. I have to say, before you get too excited about that in real terms, that returned DOC funding to the level it was at in 2008. So, it's still a long way short of where it needs to be. And so there needs to be, in fact, a succession of increases in conservation funding until we actually get the level of resources we really need. One of the things that this government has done is returned DOC to its advocacy function. So it used to be, in years gone by, that Forest and Bird might be in the courtroom supporting DOC in protecting natural values and conservation values wherever they are. Well, that has not been the case for quite some time. And very often it's been Forest and Bird standing alone in that courtroom with DOC not anywhere in sight. So Minister Sage has returned DOC to that function, which is mandated in its act. So that's a very good thing to happen. The Ruataniwha Dam case, I won't go into detail about that, but that's a victory that Forest and Bird won and was very important for us to win. Not just because that particular place would have been flooded, but because if we had lost that, the court had established that swapping conservation land was equivalent to selling it. So that if the law allowed DOC to swap out that land, it could instead just have sold land that it didn't want. So if you imagine a cash-strapped Department of Conservation at some point in the future with all of this stewardship land, well, one of the things it might be under pressure to do from a minister, for example, is to actually sell off our public conservation land. We've run a vigorous campaign on mining. I have to say we have not landed the knockout blow which we had hoped we were going to. More on that a little bit later. We've been very vigorous in our defence of pest control methods and particularly 1080 use.
Can I just ask something on that, if I don't mind interrupting?
Sure.
So with the defence of pests, why are Kia being killed in 1080 drops? And why is it acceptable? It's right by a drop where they found them. DOC have admitted that they were monitored.
So I'll give you a quick answer. There's a much more comprehensive answer that's possible. It is definitely true that some individual care, particularly if they have been living close to tramping huts or settlements where they may have been
They're pretty smart birds. I
people.
don't think you have to teach them to do anything. They're pretty smart.
Yeah, no,
They're smarter than some humans.
Just telling you what the science says. So,
But science isn't always right.
So there are some individual care who will take 1080 baits.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work going in to try to prevent them from doing that.
What happens then? So if I went to Arthur's Pass and shot a Kia,
can you listen
would
to
I
the
be in
answer?
charge?
Can you listen to the answer? So yes, some individual birds
Yeah.
sometimes will take 1080 baits and die. But the truth is that without 1080, the nesting success of care is extremely low in places where predators are present. When 1080 has been used to take out stoats, the nesting success of the care
And don't touch me,
hugely
thank you. That's assault.
increases.
Don't touch me, I just asked a question.
Sorry,
Don't
Calm
touch
down,
me.
will ya?
So what that
You're all
means,
here to listen.
I'm listening to I just asked
Well,
a question,
thank you.
okay?
So just listen.
Okay.
Just listen.
so what it means is that while some individual birds care are lost, and we're doing our very best to prevent that from happening, the overall success of the care population is hugely improved by the use of 1080 to take out those predators. So that's the fact.
Yeah. When they're totally extinct, we'll discuss it.
The Mackenzie country, I'll show you a picture in a moment, which you may already have seen. But we've been vigorously working on the Mackenzie advocacy. Tenure review was stopped by this government. Fantastic victory. That's really important for actually conserving those high country values, especially. And this last point, you may have heard me on the radio yesterday talking about this issue of habitat loss. So if we think about what is causing those 4,000 species to be driven towards extinction, and there's a variety of factors. So if you're a fish species that's being overfished, well, that will do it. If you're an albatross that's being caught on long lines, or a sea lion that's being caught as bycatch, well, that'll do it. In many cases, for our birds, for our invertebrates, for our reptiles, it's predation by predators, as we've just been talking about. That's one of the main reasons. But the other critical issue is the loss of habitat. You know, if we look at the history of this country, nearly all of our indigenous habitats have been lost. And you would think that having, for example, lost 90% of our wetlands, that we would have stopped draining wetlands, but we haven't. And what we were able to show in the information we released yesterday was that in the years between 2012 and 2018, so just 6 years, literally thousands of the remaining native habitats had been lost, with the one exception of a broadleaf forest, probably largely coprosmas. But every other, so 12 of the 13 native habitat types were all in decline, and we'd lost thousands of hectares. So for example, in this region, probably many Canterbury people don't understand how important that Matagari scrub is in biodiversity terms, but it's hugely important. And in that 6-year period, nearly 1,500 hectares of that were lost. And so, I mean, if you think across all of those different kinds of forest, of wetlands, mangroves, you know, we are continuing to lose all of those, and that is what is driving those species towards extinction. So that is Amelia Geary, who is Regional Manager for Forest and Bird in the lower part of the North Island, and she really loves forests, and she also really loves the Ruahine Forest Park, and that's her in a TV ad. And in the top right, you can't quite see them there, but they are our shy and retiring lawyers, Sally Jepp and local hero here in Christchurch, Peter Anderson, who won the case in the Supreme Court to protect the Ruahine Forest Park. That's a less inspiring picture. That's the Mackenzie. And again, like the Matagari scrub, you know, a lot of people probably think of those dry lands as being relatively barren places. But the truth is that actually the biodiversity that they protect is probably greater than a forest environment. So losing those dry lands to these enormous crop circles is nothing short of a tragedy. And the evidence is that for the most part, if the dry lands are grazed, they can come back. Once they're fertilised, they cannot. I live on the west coast, so I live just near Greymouth, and here is the Buller Coal Plateau. So Forest and Bird for many years has been engaged in, I guess you would call it a fight actually, with the mining industry over the future of this place. The northern part of the Buller Coal Plateau, and what's special about this is the particular kind of geology that means that coal is accessible at quite shallow levels and can be scooped up out of there, which is what the mining companies are interested in. That geology also means that the vegetation of that place is also special. Vegetation and the animal species that live in that, the invertebrates and the birds and so on. So we lost the northern part of the Buller Coal Plateau, and we thought that the deal was that would mean that the southern part of the plateau would be protected forever. And then they came back for the Denniston part of the plateau. Now, some of you might have had the opportunity to go up onto Denniston. I did a couple of years ago, and some of you might know that one of the things that Bathurst Resources promised about the open cast coal mine that they were going to create there was that there would be 200 jobs created locally, and that was hugely important in the court case. So the court said, well, in the end, they couldn't. Doc wasn't there in the courtroom, so we didn't have their expert evidence. They couldn't consider the climate change impacts of the mine, and they considered our evidence, the case that we had put, and they said, well, look, this is a close run thing. On balance, we think that these jobs are so important for the local economy that we have to say yes to this. Well, there are, I think, 2 jobs associated with that mine. So they dug it up, and by exposing the coal, they create a centuries-long liability, because once the coal is exposed, you also expose sulphur. And the sulphur exposed to water and air produces sulphuric acid. That sulphuric acid will drain out of that mine for centuries. And so having dug up, opened up the coal, they have to deal with that sulphuric acid, and that's what those 2 people do. Because the mine doesn't produce coal, and it wasn't economic to actually run. So now we're in a battle over Tukuha at the very southern end of the plateau, where Stevenson Resources wants to dig that up. They say there'll be 200 jobs in the mine.
Yeah, right.
So that's the next case in the Supreme Court. In case you didn't know, and lots of people even in Westport didn't know, this is what Stockton looks like. Now this is what a modern open cast coal mine now looks like. So this is not something where it's possible to dig up the coal and then we'll put back the vegetation and rehabilitate the site. That's never going to happen. When they finish, there will be an ecosystem there, but it won't be the ecosystem that existed before they started. That's gone forever. Yeah.
Thank you.
The New Zealanders don't actually approve of that. They actually want to see our places, our special places, protected from mining. And until the school strike for climate mobilisation in November last year, this was the biggest march in our country since the Springbok tour. And this was a mobilisation of people opposed to the previous government's plan to open up Schedule 4 areas for mining. So Forest and Bird will be continuing to mobilise people like this to actually protect our special places. Freshwater, I mean, you know this debate, right? So 74% of our freshwater fish, including 4 out of 5 of the fish species whose juvenile forms are referred to collectively as whitebait, are headed towards extinction. We've lost nearly all of our wetlands. 2/3 of these monitored spots in our freshwater in our rivers are not safe for swimming. So it's a crisis, and you've heard Forest and Bird talk about this previously. One of the reasons, and this is
We saw
you know what cows in a river look like, right? So, and you could imagine like some of the impacts. Here's the Mokihinui River. You know, This is the kind of wild and scenic river that Forest and Bird has been for many years seeking to protect. And again, you come back to that same thing of what are rivers for? You know, in recent weeks there have been people on the radio, Horticulture New Zealand actually in the last couple of weeks who have been using that line that I've previously heard from Irrigation New Zealand, that any drop of water that reaches the sea is a drop wasted. Well, actually, rivers don't just exist, you know, to be the source of irrigation water or a waste disposal ditch for our economic activities. They exist for their own intrinsic values and for the value that they provide for all of nature and for us. And this was a special place that we saved. So in the last year, you'll have seen Forest and Bird campaigning around whitebait. It seems extraordinary, doesn't it, that if you want to go fishing for snapper, you have to have a license, and you have to go. Actually, do you have to have a license for snapper? No. For trout anyway. And that there are catch limits. You know, whitebait is kind of the Wild West. Yeah. You know, it's and we've been saying that you should have to have a license for whitebait. There should be catch limits. There should be more restrictions, and there should be a prohibition on the commercial trade in whitebait. Water conservation orders. We've worked in this last year on the Ngautaroro River in Hawke's Bay to provide protection for the outstanding values of that river. Once again, the opposition to that water conservation order came from the people who basically want to extract more water from that river. So it's a familiar fight. We've been in the last year campaigning for better rules and for better enforcement of the rules. So even where the rules in regional plans are good, many regional councils, arguably most, do a pretty hopeless job of enforcing those rules. And so if you're someone who breaks the rules, you might well take a gamble that you're going to be able to get away with it, and probably you will. So we're working to improve enforcement. Another issue that's relevant in this region is conflicts of interest from decision makers. So Forest and Bird achieved a victory over zone committees, and where the people who had a conflict of interest because they extracted water from a river ought to be able to be part of the decision making about that river. And I think it's fair to say Bill Bayfield was quite dismissive of our chances when we said we were going to take that case, and he hasn't really spoken to me since we won. So. This last point is another one of those areas where actually the government, in the package of measures that it announced, or that David Parker announced in November as the draft on which it's been consulting people, they did better than I imagined. I thought that they were going to announce a set of draft rules that would be better than what we have, but weren't actually good enough to achieve Minister Parker's objectives, which were halt the loss of freshwater quality and then start turning it around. Actually, what he announced will probably do that. But here we are at the beginning of election year. That package hasn't landed yet. And he doesn't have a lot of time to land it now before full-on election mode is with us. More about that in a second. Climate change, and you know, with my background in geophysics, I could talk about this all night. But our key point as Forest and Bird is that climate change is not only something that impacts on us as human beings and, you know, coastal settlements and all of those things that typically dominate every discussion about climate change, not only something that impacts on our economy, but actually it's something that has profound impacts on nature. And many of the natural systems that we're talking about, you know, in the geological past actually have dealt with higher temperatures than we have now. But they have never dealt with the very rapid change of temperature and conditions that we are now beginning to experience. And many of our unique species will be at profound risk from the impacts of climate change. And so what Forest and Bird works on is highlighting both the impact of climate change on nature, but also the ways in which nature, through things like dune systems and wetlands, through native forests, which store enormous amounts of carbon, how those natural systems can actually help with the effort to mitigate the impacts. We produced a landmark report on climate change's evil twin, ocean acidification, in the last year. And we also have been campaigning for the Zero Carbon Act. And I particularly want to acknowledge the role of Forest and Bird youth in that. So you look at some of the leadership of the School Strikes for Climate movement. Well, actually, I look at those people and I see Forest and Bird youth, Forest and Bird youth, Forest and Bird youth. So our people have been at the forefront of that movement. And it's that movement that has produced the Zero Carbon Act.
Yep.
You know, if you look back a year or 18 months, that movement didn't exist. You know, the School Strikes for Climate, Fridays for the Future, was one person outside the Swedish Parliament. In that incredibly short period of time, a huge global mass movement has developed, and it has enormous political power. And we need to work with that movement to ensure that it has as much impact as it possibly can. Kapti Island. And what you can see is hillsides that were bare grass are now dense forest, populated by birds and other species that are rare elsewhere. So the work of Forest and Bird, you know, has moved beyond that protecting to restoration, and that restoration is really important. So we've come to a place where we've lost so much that just trying to hold the line and prevent any further loss is simply not going to cut it. We actually have to force a change in direction. And what Captain Sanderson's work back in the 1920s and Forest and Bird's work through all of this intervening time has shown is that is possible. I believe actually that in the last 12 months we have started to move beyond just steady loss to actually turn a corner. At the last election, we set out to change some things. We recognised that nearly everyone, 85 or 90% of people, New Zealanders, if you ask them, will say, nature is personally very important to me. But up until 2017, only 3 or 4% of people said that it was the most important issue. And some of you will know, because of your familiarity with political parties, that in a political party, if something only has 3 or 4% of people saying you have to take action on it, the strategist is going to stroke their chin and say, well, we can afford to ignore that then, and instead use our political capital and our actual spending money in government on something that people do prioritise. Forest and Bird set out to change that, and we realised that what was driving that was that people didn't understand the crisis. they thought, and Ken Huey's work here in Christchurch, on people's beliefs about the environment. Most people whose ideas about the state of nature came from all of that international marketing that we're all soaking in about New Zealand as a 100% pure, clean, green country, or alternatively from the TV1 news, where the conservation story is the thing that comes on after the weather, before the next program, and it's a good news story about rare birds being released into some place that they haven't been before. People generalise from those points, and most people don't actually have that much contact with nature themselves, or don't know how to interpret what they're saying. And so they were wanting to believe that good news story. And so they really cared about it. It was personally important to them, but they thought it was doing fine, so they didn't have to prioritise it at the election. And so Forest and Bird set out to change that. And in our campaign in 2017, we lifted that 3 or 4% where it had been for decades to 17%. One of the top 3 issues at the 2017 election, alongside health at 19% and housing at 18%. As a consequence, all political parties had to change and improve their policies on environment and conservation. So whoever had formed the government that we had for this particular term, we would have had better policies. As it is, this government has done a lot of things. A number of those things still need to be landed. So don't look at that transparency yet. It's not. I haven't quite reached that point. So just ignore that. Just listen to me. So I mentioned, for example, no new mines on public conservation land, announced in the speech from the throne at the very beginning of this term. Nowhere in sight. At the beginning of this term, regulations were in place to require cameras on every fishing boat.
That's not happening.
And not only has it not happened, actually those regulations have been revoked. I've talked about those marine protected areas that we still haven't seen. I guess the jury is out on freshwater. Will that be landed? This national policy statement on Indigenous biodiversity that sets out to provide tools for landowners, communities, regional councils to protect those native habitats on private land as well. Is that going to be landed? So where I live on the west coast, there's talk about the national policy statement being, a huge new confiscation of private land, and you can see that our partners actually in developing that draft national policy statement, because Forest and Bird was intimately involved in that, our partners in doing that were federated farmers who now are trying to undermine the policy. So will this government has got maybe another 2 months, maybe, to land policy change before it's in full-on electioneering mode, when it probably won't do anything but might have political risk. So the jury is still out on those things. So what Forest and Bird is doing this year is trying to reprise the kind of strategy that we successfully used in 2017. That high level of public concern has stayed high. So it is still, the environment is still one of the very top concerns of New Zealanders. And within that, freshwater quality has remained high, and climate change has emerged as a separate, really high priority for people. It's election year though. So what's going to happen is that as the year wears on, there'll be all sorts of other issues coming to the forefront, and we have to ensure that these issues stay at the very top of people's concern. Because that degradation, that damage that has occurred over such a long time doesn't get reversed in 3 years. Job done, move on to the next thing. It's going to take decades of work. And so we need to ensure that it remains at the very top of government's agenda, whichever government it is. And so here's what we're saying. We're saying nature is at breaking point. We're saying that New Zealanders love nature and want to protect it. And every single piece of evidence we have suggests that that's true. We're saying we need nature, and I'll refer you back to that Herman Daly idea of everything that happens in the economy and in society as being a subset within the boundaries of nature. So when we damage nature, we necessarily damage ourselves. But nature needs us. That's the other part of the equation. So we need nature, but nature can't do it just itself. It needs us to change the way that we interact with nature. And so this election, it's time to put nature first. Thank you.
Thanks. Time for a few questions. I have one, Kevin. I'm an activist as well as involved in politics, and I see the role of activists and people like Forrest and Bird and others pushing political parties to do better.
Yep.
However, I don't believe any political party that gets in there is going to do what you want. So I am opting for a Labour and Greens, okay? And it disturbs me that a lot of young people see this message and they say, no point in voting. And by not saying that there is an option, there are people with these policies, by just being the activists and not recognising the role of change, what's your feeling about that?
So I guess I recognise the danger, Rosemary. So in 2017, the evidence is that what Forrest and Bird did, and we did the same things we're looking to do. So national speaking tour for me with my orchestra. Thank you. The TV advertising that we did in 2017, we'll do more of that in this year. What we are urging people to do is engage in the political process. Yeah. So we're saying, enrol to vote. Talk to everyone you know about the importance of enrolment, the importance of activism in the election itself, putting nature at the very top of the list, and actually ensuring that everybody votes. So clearly that worked in 2017. We're going to be doing more of that this year. The other point that I would make is I don't think that the government has done a good enough job of explaining to the community what it has done. I think that if you take together the things that the government has been working on, there is a fantastic story to tell. And it's a story about changing the relationship between the economy, the environment and people, and saying the economy is not the point of what we do. The economy is actually the servant of society and of the environment. And if those economic tools are not achieving that, then we need to retool the economy to actually protect the environment and invigorate and support society. And I don't actually hear that from the government. I don't hear that they're fundamentally changing those relationships. Instead, when they talk about these policies, they talk about them as isolated things and not as part of a single major transformative change. So for those of you in the room who do have contact with political parties, that would be my suggestion. So we'll be working on the activist part, but actually there's a role of it.
Just Rick.
In September, when we've got Prime Minister Bridges having his bonfire, which of the regulations do you think he's going to throw on them? And those of us who are activists, which are the ones we're going to have to get most concerned about?
He's not going to give him 3 hours.
Woohoo! Bonfire.
It's good to see there's an optimist in the room. Hey, I think we do need to be worried about environmental protection regulations. So actually, part of Nationals, Forest and Bird is not politically aligned at all. But I think if we were to reflect on previous national governments, one of the things that they have said about the Resource Management Act, for example, is that it puts unnecessary red tape in the path of developers. Well, actually, that suggests that some of the fundamental protections that we have in place for the natural world may be at risk, in fact, from that sort of bonfire of regulations. So I think, what that means is that we all have to do our best to actually tell that big story as well ourselves about the importance of law like the RMA, Conservation Act, and others in protecting those really basic natural values, and that connection between those natural values and the environment upon which we all depend.
Kia ora, Kevin, we're going to draw it to a close bit. You can talk to Kevin staying around for a little bit. Thank you very much. Some people like to get away at 7. Thank you very much, Kevin.